Welcome back to Ohio Counseling Conversations, the official podcast of the Ohio Counseling Association, bringing you updates and conversations from around the state. We are excited to announce that this month marks our 1-year anniversary since our first episode aired. Today, we are flipping the script and bringing you a unique, behind-the-scenes conversation with our podcast host, Dr. Marisa Cargill. Marisa is a teletherapist, counselor educator, advocate, and supervisor here in the state of Ohio. A couple of years ago, she answered the call from OCA leadership and helped to lay the groundwork for this podcast, to which she brings her previous podcasting experience, authenticity, and curiosity to each conversation. Today, you'll hear her talking with Kaylee Bradley, member of the podcast team and guest from our very first episode. As we celebrate our 1-year anniversary, we want to express our gratitude to everyone who has taken the time to listen, all of our guests, and the entire Ohio counseling community for all that you do. Please enjoy our 1-year anniversary episode.
Good morning, Marisa. How are you today?
I'm great, Kaylee. Thank you. I'm
You're
excited
so,
for our
yeah.
conversation.
Yes, me too. So this will be a little bit of a different episode where we get to kind of get a glimpse of what goes on behind the scenes of Ohio Counseling Conversations. So yeah, we're super excited. So Marissa, tell me a little bit, share about your background, and kind of the history, maybe of your involvement with the podcast, but also kind of the podcast in general.
Yeah, I feel like I tell this to my students a lot, but I don't know if it's ever been something that we've talked about on the podcast. My background, my undergrad was in mass media, radio, TV specifically, and sociology with a minor in psych.
Very cool. Yeah.
So in my undergrad years, I got involved in the college radio station, and you could hear me on FM radio back in the day. And it was really exciting. It was really fun. It's how I got to know a lot of people when I was in undergrad. And as I evolved into my early adulthood, some life circumstances made me decide that maybe those avenues or those fields weren't exactly right for me. I had always been interested in studying people and helping people, and had gotten into situations in most of the jobs that I had held up into that point where I trained people. So I was always like a teacher in some ways, uh, but knowing that life was hard, dealing with some family illness and loss and things like that led me to decide I don't think I want to go back to be like an HR professional where I'm training in that way. No shade to them. That's an awesome career.
Just
Uh,
not for you, right?
but yeah, I felt particularly called to saying well, I can help people in a different way, based on maybe the experiences that I've had. My dad died of cancer when I was 22 in my last semester of college, and um, I was too maybe young and too close to the situation for that to have turned my career trajectory at that very moment. But then later, several years later, my niece was born with an awkward heart condition, which led her to having open heart surgery as an infant and hospital for a few weeks. And being that we had, as a family unit, had spent a lot of time in hospital already because of my dad, it just kind of brought back that oh yeah, there's a reason that you're qualified or called to this. And so I decided that's what I'm going to go back to school for. And I decided shortly thereafter to enroll in master's in counseling program. Um,
Mhm.
it didn't take me away from my passion for media though. And so pop culture always
Yeah.
something like really interested and passionate about. And I liked being able to share some of that stuff. I did a short stint of hosting my own podcast at one point in time. And so, about, I would say, almost 2 years ago this spring, our OCA leadership put a call out asking anyone interested in like maybe starting up a podcast for our organization? Well, that seemed like such a great opportunity. I have been involved in OCA since my master's program, and so it'd been over a decade or about a decade at that time. No, it's been over a decade. Where I was, like, involved and I had, like, a couple areas and I had tried wearing a few different hats and, hadn't necessarily felt like I found my own niche yet in OCA. And then when I got this email, I was like, "Well, duh, come on. Come on now, Marissa." Like, this is another situation where I felt maybe called or qualified. And
Mhm.
so,
Yeah, I love
I
that.
figured
Yeah, how you've been able to integrate a lot of your different interests. And yeah, no, I think it's important for listeners to be reminded of that, that we
yeah,
all
we're
bring different gifts
hopeful.
to the table, right?
Yeah, and then all of those experiences and backgrounds still, can support us in this field.
Yeah.
So, I find myself using examples from media a lot, like when I'm working with clients and students and things
Mhm. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
help just bring things to light. But yeah, it was awesome to receive that call, and then since then, it took us almost a year from, like, inception of, like, "Let's create this idea," to getting the podcast off the ground, and so we published our first episode in February of 2023, so we're,
Hard
like
to believe.
like, episode
Happy anniversary, right?
to celebrate, the progress and the things that we've done, and then, like, the hopes of what we continue to do, and um, I am very grateful to our leadership for having the idea, because it certainly helped me fulfill some of like my passions. And also super grateful to our podcast team because this is a lot of work and um, we're small but mighty. I think I say it in almost every monthly meeting that we have. A small but mighty
Smoldering.
where
Yeah.
we, organize and try to help get this information and these episodes out to our membership and anyone really. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, how would you kind of describe kind of the main theme or concept of our podcast, and maybe share a little bit about how that the Ohio counseling conversations that theme kind of came about.
Yeah. So, yeah, the first call was just like, hey, anyone interested in it? And then that development was really, well, what do we want the podcast to look like and how will it operate? Certainly, there are other podcasts like the ACA's podcast, The Voice of Counseling, that we were able to say, like, hey, how is this helpful? How's this productive? And how can we maybe use that as not a guidepost or goalpost, but some like informed practice, best practice, like what are some other mental health counseling podcasts that we feel like are value adds really. And so as we had those conversations, I think it was developed that like the mission of the podcast is really to help disseminate information to counselors in Ohio. We recognize that the podcast is a free way to like have anyone listen, so it's not specific to just members. Um, but it's a way to have that information out to professionals and also like I would say the general public so that some of this is demystified in terms of like hey, here's why therapy and counseling can be useful, and here's where there are people who specialize in these topics, or that our profession cares about these things. So I think anyone who might just like happen upon it, it could still be valuable even if you're not a counseling professional.
Absolutely. So I know we've had special moments in so many of our different episodes with all of our guests. Yeah, any that stand out to you, Marissa? Special moments or special, episodes that maybe have stood out as memorable. I
You
know
know,
there's a lot.
it's hard to choose one. I don't think I could. What I feel, and I hope that we also like as professionals probably have this like parallel process when we're in session with clients and things like that is that you have certain moments in conversations where it's not just the conversation itself, but like there's
Mhm.
something that happens in this genuine conversation
Mhm.
like, oh, they said that, or oh, they digested that. And I feel like I've been more like in the client role in interviewing and stuff like this, even though I'm asking questions, as hosting most of these episodes, it seems like I'm taking in a lot of that information that our guests have shared with us, that it's been really powerful. And also, I don't want to say changed my mind, but just added perspective. And so, I try to have a pretty open mind anyway. So don't, it's not that I'm like stubborn, although I'm sure if you ask my sister, she might. But like I try to have an open mind about like how we come to the table, but certainly we have our own like orientations and things like that
For sure,
our
for sure.
practice. But I feel like every guest in some part of our conversation has touched me in a way that has been like, oh yeah, I didn't think of it that way. And so it's just been like really cool. And I hope that our listeners get that from the episodes too.
Absolutely. Kind of a little bit on those lines. Any challenges, or what have you learned kind of hosting this podcast? What's been, yeah, the challenges, I guess?
I'm laughing because I'm like, when I saw this question. I think I could write another dissertation, learned. So we won't go into the whole dissertation.
It's a lot of work, though. Yeah, I think that's important to highlight. There's a lot that goes into this for sure.
A lot of work, and um, it still has a lot of power, right? Like, I think I wouldn't be so passionate about media if I didn't recognize that there's a lot of value in it, and for people at different stages. So, when I will say we went to excuse me, we went to Ohio, and I was at the table talking with folks, trying to make sure people knew the podcast existed. There are people who didn't know. Okay, cool. Like, we understand we're still in our infancy in some ways. So, that taught us, like, how do we do this, like, marketing piece? And while I might have had some of this background in undergrad of, like, doing, like, the production stuff and the editing and actually recording episodes and being like air quote talent, I didn't like do a lot of the marketing side of it. That wasn't like what I was trained for. And so just learning some of those logistics has been really powerful and meaningful. Learning some of these other specialty areas. But the challenges have been a lot about like really our bandwidth as a team because we're small and mighty, and honoring that in a lot of ways while also trying to serve our mission. One of the things I think I've learned not just from this podcast, but I would say like podcasts in general, and that part of it has felt inspiring is, I know you are a pretty avid reader. I might not
Mhm.
read books like as frequently, but I read a lot of articles, and it could be
Yeah,
pop culture articles, it could be academic.
absolutely. That all counts. It all counts.
So we've heard about this like loneliness epidemic, right?
Mm,
The fact that people are lonely. And I think about it sometimes in that unique context of like counselors, because while we work with people all day every day, and counselor educators even too, but like it can be an isolating profession, right? Because of what we really can't then talk about.
yeah. We carry a lot. We carry a lot that we don't have a space to
And so
expel. Yeah.
it's
Hmm.
so helpful to have community. And I feel like podcasting gives a sense of feeling less alone, because it's like maybe you're listening to the conversation, but you feel like you're sitting there with friends having the conversation. Maybe it's not exactly the same as sitting in a room where there's like some group consultation or things, but for someone who's feeling really isolated and maybe doesn't have that opportunity at this very moment to do that, it can give some of that like less aloneness, less loneliness,
Love that.
uh,
Yeah.
less
Mhm.
that silo effect. So I think that that is something I've learned is a value in podcasts for me. And so I think that speaks to challenges in our profession, but that maybe our podcast helps to support.
I love that. Yeah. So walk us through kind of a behind the scenes snapshot here. Yeah, what are the steps that go into creating an episode? And then I also love this part of the question that we came up. Do you personally have any little rituals or routines that you kind of follow before you conduct these interviews? So give
Ah.
a backstage pass here.
um, well, okay. This is a multifaceted question, right? So when
Yes, wherever you want.
um gosh, okay. So when we think about like how we prepare, there are so many steps to putting a podcast out. And the way our small but mighty team looks at it is like, okay, we've got pre-production, production, post-production. And those are our big hats, but like within those, there's so many other like um added layers and steps. So as we pre-produce, we're coming up with guests who are interested, guest ideas, guest topics that we think would be relevant of what might be happening in the state, the country, the world, and trying to figure out who could fit that uh topic well, like, or who could discuss that with us, who could have that conversation. And so there's a lot of thought that goes into it, but then that's just like very beginning stages, right? Then we have to start outreach to those people and developing like specific questions for them, gathering information so that when we do want to market episodes, we have information and pictures and things like that that we could share on social media. So there's a lot that goes into that stage before we ever even like press record. So that's a lot. I would say like, that takes up quite a bit of time. What we have found works really well is collaborating on like developing those questions. So thankfully, those are things that we can do relatively easily, like in a virtual way.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
and then production, which is not always without its challenges. We've had, people get logged off in the middle of recording.
Yes, we have.
You know,
Technology.
technology not working, microphones not working, headphones
Yeah.
not working. Going into some of those and just ironing out those kinks amidst like the recording, and so it can be taxing in its own way there too. But generally, I will say, like for me, obviously, that feels like the most fun part of the
The
system,
actual interviewing. Yeah.
the conversations, and hear what's being discussed. And we often, I know you've worn this hat many times. It's not just me having a conversation one on one with most of these people. It's that we usually have someone else from our team serving in that like producer role so that they're taking notes for our show notes, and they're documenting when there are technology issues so that when it goes to post production and editing, our editor Leah like knows really well, like, oh, there were issues at minute
Mhm.
mark or whatever, and able to work more effectively and efficiently that way.
Absolutely.
Asking follow-up questions if for like then I'm caught up in the conversation and it doesn't occur to me like we missed something, that like I sort of have those backup people in my corner to support it. So it's been a lot even in that. And then the hat of editing, um, whoever's hosted the episode, we usually then go back and record an intro to say like, oh, here's like sort of what we talked about.
There's
And
a lot of moving pieces. Yeah, a lot of moving pieces.
quite a bit that goes into it. And then once once the episode is posted, we, then listen to it to make sure like it's all good to go, and have to publish the episode on like our podcasting platforms, but then also like, the marketing of it afterwards. It's not just released that you've probably seen on social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn posts to say, hey, check us out. So
Yeah.
lots of stages. Um, and then the other part of that question, Kaylee, remind me.
Personal. Yeah. Are there any personal rituals that you like to kind of tap into as you start the interview process?
Yes, but I'm not always good at them. So I'm human. I tell my students and my clients this all the time. So I have taught the counseling techniques class for many years. This is the first semester. I think I haven't been teaching it in some time. And what I'm always like encouraging, like, watching out for fillers and multiple questions and things like that, that we try to isolate and work on so that we can make sure our communication is, really positive with our clients. And then every time I listen to the episodes, I'm like, oh, I did it. I asked two questions or being like eye roll, but I do try to be like really intentional, at least in moments. Sometimes I
Yeah.
just get so animated and excited that I
Yeah, it's
go
hard.
off
It's hard
script,
to,
you know?
yeah, make sure that I'm even noticing I'm laughing because I peppered you with kind of multiple parts to my last question. So I'm chuckling inwardly too. Yeah.
Hyper aware
Yeah.
of it. I do it in sessions and I'm always like, "Oh, I'm gonna have to remember and tell my students." Like, we still do it because we're human, but the idea is working on some of those things so that we can be, clear with our communication. But I I always think about that for certain as like
Yeah.
a ritual and review the questions, certainly, like some of those basic things, but I think I also just tried to say, like, okay, if you're nervous about this interview, one of the rituals I try to do is normalize that with the guest. So I know
Yeah,
you
that's so
share
important. Yeah.
uh
Mm.
that, like, hey, this might be new to you. Some people have done podcasts before and some people haven't. I feel like we've run the gamut with our guests, and just to talk to them about what to expect and how this is like, I don't want to say low stakes because it's not important what we're talking about, but that because we want it to be conversational, it's okay if you mess up. Like anything that we would tell someone else, that we were helping in our profession, I want that our guests feel the same way. So I think that probably would be a good part of the ritual of like just normalizing, like, it's okay if you're nervous. And if we mess up, if I mess up, if you mess up, you don't like how you said something,
It's all good.
in a cool environment where we can do some editing and fix that. So I don't want people to feel pressured. I just want it to feel like a cool conversation that we're about to have.
No, I really like that. And I think it also, hopefully, anybody listening who maybe is like, hey, maybe I want to be a guest on a podcast, but I'm a little bit nervous. Hopefully, to hear that, from you, kind of that normalization, I think could be helpful. Speaking of guests, the next question leads right into this. What qualities or stories do you kind of look for in potential interviewees or guests? How do you kind of go through that selection process?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I mentioned before, when we're looking at like the pre-production side of things, we're thinking about like maybe some things that just could also be relevant information for the counseling professionals in the state of Ohio. So that aligns with our mission. But we know like stuff that might be relevant in Ohio can also be relevant in the country, in the world, the galaxy, if you will. So I think it's considering like relevancy. Obviously, there's this practical things too of like availability, those things. We do try to say like, okay, if we're looking at the calendar, is there something that might be a good fit this month because of it being a specific holiday or awareness month, those types of things. Sometimes that's easier said than done because of availability in other situations. But we do try to be pretty intentional with like the person that we're interviewing being in the counseling profession. And I would say, like, to me, I think a quality that helps, although sometimes we don't know it until we're having those conversations, is people are passionate about something. And it could be like about the profession as a whole, but also maybe about their specific topic. Like Keely, I know like you were our very first episode. You're very passionate about your grief work, right?
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
like, like, can vividly remember I was sitting in the same room. But then think I commented on the fact that, like, we could hear the passion topic coming through. And I will say, like, I feel like I've recognized that in all of our guests, that, like, what they've
Yeah,
kind of brought to the table, like,
there's
resembles
that passion.
expressions that help people exhibit their passion, which I just think is, like,
Yeah,
so cool.
it is. And I love that we give people a space to highlight. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those niche areas and those passions. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, so this is kind of maybe a lighter or a fun question. And we were kind of talking about this before we started, Marissa, but guests, right? Are there any dream guests that you have that you might, or that you would love to have, I guess, on the podcast? We jokingly, kind of threw out some big names before we got on here, but yeah, who would you love
I still
to?
might jokingly throw them back out, but
Yeah.
when I say jokingly, like, "Oh, everyone says there's a little bit of truth to just kidding." Like, "Oh, yeah, we have these people now, they're not all from a counseling background." So,
Mhm.
I have to, like, preface it with that be part of, like, oh, we're not aligning with the full, like, charge, I think, from leadership in some ways. But I am very passionate about Bravo television, and I know I'm not alone in the counseling field with that, right?
No.
I know that also might be
Not
very
at all.
niche. So, I would say, like, Andy Cohen, father of Bravo TV,
Yes.
would be on that list. And,
Wouldn't he be a fun? He'd be so fun to have.
you know,
Yeah.
he hosts Radio Andy, right? But he also, because of, like, being part of that world, he's exposed to all these relationships and people. And so I think part of why I find it so interesting is just, like, watching those dynamics. And, uh, you know, I passively watch it a lot, like, where it's just playing in the background, but, like, don't get it twisted. I also will sit down and, like, be engaged, So I think he would be really interesting. He also is a
Mhm.
radio host. So, like, his podcasting and his interviewing experience, he hosts, his other shows as well. Could be really interesting to take away with that media side of it. Not just counsel, but he would be a big one. I would say also, like, other Bravo lebs, as they call them. So Bravo celebrities, I think would be really interesting. There are, interestingly, on these shows, often filmed therapy sessions, which is a whole,
Oh,
I
yeah.
guess,
That's a
like,
good point.
topic
Mhm.
for episode. I'm interested to maybe talk to some of those people to
Mhm.
be like, huh, what
Yeah.
made you make that decision? Like, where'd that come from? Like,
Mhm.
because I think it can be destigmatizing, but it also can, like, lead to maybe some ethical
Mm.
issues. So it's, like, a very interesting.
Yeah, how to navigate all of that.
Yeah.
No, those
Um,
would be really interesting conversations. Absolutely.
maybe more counseling specific folks that I would be interested in, as I share with you. I know that we haven't really been using, like, our video features, but in case we decide to use them, and I know it's going to look backwards for my screen probably. Nedra Glover Tawwab, if you haven't heard of her, she is an author and a counseling professional who wrote New York Times bestseller Set Boundaries, Find Peace. It's a book
Mhm.
about
So good.
boundaries, super digestible, has other stuff. This is not an ad. She's not paying me to say this. I just think she would be great because her books and her, like, journaling and, like, practices and some of these are so tangible and digestible for
Very,
people.
very practical.
And
Absolutely.
so I think that they can be, when we think about access as an issue for clients,
Mhm.
that this is something that makes, like, that whole conversation about helping people identify and then communicate their needs, their wants, their expectations for their relationships in life, for, like, their workplace, for all of these different things is just so digestible. And I love, like, the practical advice she gives on her social media. It's all just, like, really digestible and accessible, which I think as a profession we could do better with making, we're
Right.
always trying. Let's be
Building those
like
bridges, right,
building more
between
access.
yeah, research and clinical practice. Absolutely. Those are good answers. Very good answers. Yeah. So we're kind of shifting a little bit here into just some questions on kind of the future of the podcast. So in general, Marissa, how do you envision kind of the future of Ohio counseling conversations? Are there any changes or directions you're considering? So yeah, just kind of where do you see this going?
It's a great question.
And
I don't
again,
have
I
any
did it again, Marissa. I packed in multiple
I have to
questions there.
this
So
ball. It's like a newer version, a newer age Magic 8 ball. So I'm like, maybe we should ask it. I don't know.
yeah.
It doesn't give us a good answer. So, the future, I guess, like, to me, I don't know if we can fully predict that, right? But the idea is to sort of maintain the progress that we've made, and maybe grow into new territories where we are able to interview authors that are outside of the state of Ohio who can shed light and give more tips on how we can navigate maybe some of the challenges that are happening in our country or in our state, but also to bring more of our divisions into like episodes, or just even like our team to advocate like what topics need to be addressed. And um I think that that would be really helpful because our mission is to support everyone in OCA, and we want to make sure that like that access is provided, encouraged, and that I know passion is not something that we have a shortage of in OCA. In fact,
Mm,
we have it by the dozens,
yeah.
more than that, probably more than the dozens. I was going to say like by the millions, but that, I don't know how many passions y'all have, but
Yeah.
I feel like we have so many passionate people, so many different topics that they're passionate about, that I want people to feel like that they have a voice through this podcast. It's not just our little committee. It's really the profession and our organization that we want to be able to positively represent. And without having maybe heard some of those passions, we don't get to do that as fully as we could. So I just hope that we continue to be able to gain that and represent diverse voices, diverse interests, and uh, help people learn, right? Help
Yeah.
people grow personally and professionally, and feel, maybe to my earlier point, less alone by being able to hear what we're sharing.
Yeah. I love what you said about OCA having just a lot of passionate members, and I think we should all feel really proud, as OCA members. I think, yeah, that's a real distinctive, I think,
And
of our
I
village. I really do.
maybe for the younger professionals, like
Mhm.
newer professionals listening, we also recognize like the rich history Ohio counseling
Mm,
had in the whole profession of counseling, right? That's like, and that is partially because of the amount of passion that's
mhm.
state and in this organization. And so certainly I don't take that lightly, and I don't think I would be involved in this organization if I wasn't exposed to so many passionate people and advocates, right? Like, I think that we do a great job, and we have a lot to say, and a lot of people saying it. So I just hope that we get to hear more of that as the podcast continues.
I love that. So these are kind of some recommendation kind of questions to kind of start, landing this plane, bringing us home a little bit. But do you have maybe recommendations for other podcasts that our listeners might enjoy?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. What are your faves? Favorite
Um,
podcasts?
well, so like, oh gosh, this is like going to be a lot of self disclosure here, huh? I always tell people the majority of the podcasts I listen to are not counseling, like professional podcasts.
So free though, right? We need those
my
those outlets.
my passion
Totally.
for Bravo has certainly taken me to a lot of reality TV podcasts. Now,
Yeah.
we're thinking about like not just counseling specific podcasts, but topical podcasts. I know you and I did discuss this question a little bit before, and we're both quite fond of All There Is. which is by
Mhm.
Anderson Cooper, is a very grief-focused podcast. And certainly, I will say there might be some trigger warnings with many of those episodes because they do deal with sometimes very heavy things. But, like I said, like I feel like much like our podcast and that there's loneliness,
Mhm.
being a witness to some of those conversations does help in the same ways group therapy can help sometimes, like, right? People feel less alone because they know they're not the only ones who's gone through maybe something really difficult. So I found that one is really positive. I also think um, that one came to me by way of clients. It was not something that I was
I
like
love that. Yeah.
suggestively,
Yeah.
my clients were sharing. Uh, the voice of counseling, obviously, ACAs that I mentioned, it's certainly really digestible, practical, topical stuff that's happening. And I would say, like, also be listening to that as much as you're listening to this, because certainly they're bringing up relevant conversations. That's just like their mission as well, right? With some others, I I've heard the concept of like hate listening, and I don't think it's that. I think it's also very topical and conversational, but there's just so many. There's one that's called and then one of my students actually suggested this to me. It's called Welcome to Group Therapy.
Oh, I've not heard of that one.
It's not it's hosted by 4 mental health professionals, but none of them are
Okay.
counselors.
None of
So
them are
I
counselors.
feel like it's interesting to hear their takes and their backgrounds. I think there are 2 psychologists and 2 social workers, if I'm not mistaken. It might social work and psychology, I can't remember the proportion. But knowing that, like, we all maybe experience clients in similar ways, their conversations can be really interesting. My students who were listening to it found value in it because they also do, like, some ask me anything episodes where, like, you can ask as a young professional or newer professional questions that they might, and so there's our topical, like, their most recent episode, video games and mental health. So they talk
Oh,
about
love
different
that.
things. They poll their audiences to then share some of those results. So I will say I don't necessarily catch every episode, but I always think it's unique. Some of the things that they bring up, people's takes on CBT or, like, whatever.
Yeah.
It's interesting to listen to.
Mm,
Yeah.
very cool. So, Marissa, we ask all of our guests a specific question. So, we're going to flip the tables. You usually ask it, but I'm going to ask you, what conversations do you feel that counselors need to be having right now?
Yeah. Oh gosh. I think it goes back to that loneliness
Mm,
conversation I was mentioning earlier, that we need to be finding ways to connect with each other in meaningful ways. And so I know the podcast can be that, but finding, resources and support from each other is so critical, and being willing to do those same things that we would want a client who maybe felt very isolated to do, right? We know it's not always easy to reach out when you're feeling overwhelmed and things like that. So it's also important to make sure, like, even if you don't feel so isolated, that you're connecting with other people and just checking in, so that we can better support each other. I know, like, when I'm reading a lot of things, it is also like that people leave this profession, right? So we
mhm.
don't want that by any means. And I don't see just as counseling, but like mental health, right? Because some of the challenges we face that we haven't even gotten into today, um, that we're monitoring that so that we can support each other, avoid like that vicarious trauma, the burnout, all of that maybe compiles into people's reasons for leaving. I know those aren't the only reasons, but I also know that sometimes those contribute quite a bit. So, um,
Yeah, this work is too hard to do alone. I say
yeah,
that to my supervisees a lot. Yeah,
so
so I
working
agree.
to just
Yeah,
like avoid our own counseling loneliness epidemic.
absolutely.
That's a
Absolutely.
conversation. Yep. Thanks
Wonderful.
for
Thanks, Marissa. So, in closing, my friend, is there anything else that you want to share, either about the podcast, your own passions? Where can listeners connect and stay updated on our podcast?
Yeah,
So
all
we'll kind of land this
of
plane.
social media channels. If you're on any of those, there's generally the OCA link tree. We hope that we'll be able to be even more accessible through the OCA website. So there's a lot of ways to get to us. You can also email us at ohiocounselingconversations@gmail.com. Interested in being a guest, interested in learning more about helping our small but mighty team with any part of the process, suggesting a guest. There's lots of ways. Our show notes also have forms where you can do those kinds of things. So we're always trying to find ways to be accessible to our listeners and our organization. And if you have ideas about any of those being improved upon, or just how we can maybe represent one of our passionate voices, we're all ears and want you here. So come on down. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Marisa. And just to summarize, I think one of the things that stood out to me in our conversation today was how conversations in general can help feelings of loneliness, right? So we hope that this podcast and this conversation continues to do that for our listeners. And as Marisa said, we'd love to hear ideas on potential guests, topics, all of that good stuff. And we appreciate you taking the time to listen to our talk today.
Ohio Counseling Conversations is on a mission to make this podcast meaningful to you, and we can't do that without your help. A feedback form is linked in the show notes for this episode and is also available on the OCA linktree. If you have any recommendations for topics or guests or any other general feedback, you can let us know by using the form. We welcome your thoughts so that we can continue to develop the podcast and grow as creators. If you are interested in joining the team or being a guest, you can also reach us by emailing ohiocounselingconversations@gmail.com. We value your insight. Thank you so much for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to follow us so you can stay up to date with Ohio Counseling Conversations online and wherever you listen to podcasts.
This podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Counseling Association's Media, Public Relations, and Membership Committee and its podcast subcommittee. This podcast features original music selections by Elijah Sotoder-Wood and our closing song, A Creation Discotheque by Who AD. Views, beliefs, or references mentioned in this episode do not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the Ohio Counseling Association. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect the view of the Ohio Counseling Association or any of its officials. Thank you.